You are halfway through reading the Bible when something stops you cold. A verse seems to say one thing with complete certainty, but a few chapters later, another passage appears to say the opposite. You read it again, convinced you must have misunderstood. Then you compare them side by side, and the uncomfortable feeling only grows stronger. Nobody warned you that this moment might come. Nobody told you that sincere readers, including believers, skeptics, historians, and theologians, have wrestled with these same questions for centuries. Instead, many people experience a quiet panic. If these passages seem difficult to reconcile, what does that mean? Does it mean the text cannot be trusted? Does it mean you are reading it incorrectly? Or does it reveal something deeper about how ancient writings work and how human beings search for certainty? That moment is far more common than many people admit. It is not limited to people losing faith, nor is it limited to people defending faith. It happens because our minds naturally expect consistency. We assume that if a book is important, every sentence should fit together as neatly as pieces of a puzzle. But what if that expectation belongs more to the modern reader than to the ancient world? What if the discomfort begins not with the Bible itself, but with the assumptions we quietly bring into it before reading the first page? Think about how often people search for certainty rather than understanding. We rarely ask what a passage meant to the people who first heard it. Instead, we ask whether it immediately confirms what we already believe. That tendency is not unique to religion. It shapes politics, relationships, history, and even our memories. We all prefer information that reinforces our existing worldview because uncertainty feels threatening. It creates psychological tension that our minds instinctively want to resolve. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Maybe you came across two passages that appeared impossible to reconcile. One emphasized justice, while another emphasized mercy. One seemed to describe events in one order, while another described them differently. Instead of curiosity, you felt pressure. You wanted an answer immediately because living with unanswered questions is emotionally exhausting. That reaction says as much about human psychology as it does about the text itself. Some readers conclude that every apparent contradiction has a perfect explanation waiting to be discovered. Others conclude that every apparent contradiction proves the entire work unreliable. Both responses offer relief because they replace uncertainty with certainty. Yet reality is often less comfortable. Historians point out that the Bible is not a single book written by one author at one moment in history. It is a collection of texts composed across centuries in different languages for different audiences, reflecting different literary styles and theological emphases. From that perspective, it should not surprise us that readers sometimes notice tension between passages. If this question has ever crossed your mind, or if you have struggled to understand how different passages fit together, share your perspective below. Whether you are convinced there are contradictions or convinced there are reasonable explanations, the conversation itself reveals something fascinating about how people approach truth. The deeper question may not be whether the Bible contains apparent contradictions. It may be why those moments affect us so strongly. Why do they provoke anxiety in some people and curiosity in others? Why do some readers see complexity while others see collapse? Before examining specific examples, it is worth asking whether the greatest conflict is inside the text or inside our expectations of what any sacred book is supposed to be. Imagine two people sitting at the same table with the same Bible open to the same pages. One reaches the conclusion that the differences between certain passages make the text profoundly human. The other reaches the conclusion that those same differences reveal an even deeper kind of unity that cannot be understood by reading isolated verses. Neither person is pretending the difficult passages do not exist. They simply begin with different assumptions about what those passages are supposed to accomplish. That is where the conversation becomes much more interesting than a simple argument over who is right. Human beings have a remarkable ability to notice evidence that supports what they already expect to find. Psychologists often describe this tendency as confirmation bias. Once we believe something, our attention naturally gravitates toward information that reinforces it, while explanations that challenge it receive much less weight. This happens in politics, relationships, science, and religion alike. A skeptic may immediately notice every apparent inconsistency while overlooking centuries of scholarly attempts to reconcile those passages. A committed believer may focus entirely on harmonizations while paying less attention to questions that remain genuinely debated. Neither response automatically reflects dishonesty. It reflects something deeply human. We want stability. We want our worldview to feel coherent. Think back to a disagreement you had with someone close to you. Weeks later, each of you probably remembered the same conversation differently. Neither memory necessarily came from bad intentions. Each memory was shaped by emotion, perspective, and the details that stood out most strongly. Now multiply that challenge across generations of oral tradition, multiple authors, different literary genres, distinct historical circumstances, and translations into numerous languages. Suddenly, the existence of difficult passages feels less surprising. The remarkable question becomes not why differences exist, but how such a diverse collection of writings has continued inspiring discussion across thousands of years. One of the most emotionally challenging moments for many readers arrives when they discover that thoughtful people within the same faith tradition sometimes disagree about interpretation. They expect certainty and instead encounter complexity. For some, that discovery feels like disappointment. For others, it becomes the beginning of genuine intellectual maturity. They realize that wrestling with difficult questions has always been part of engaging seriously with ancient texts. The search itself becomes meaningful. Consider how often we confuse confidence with truth. A person who speaks with absolute certainty can appear convincing even when the evidence is incomplete. Meanwhile, someone who openly acknowledges uncertainty may seem weaker despite presenting a more balanced view. Our minds are drawn towards certainty because certainty feels safe. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that many important questions resist simple answers. Religion is no exception. This becomes especially evident when readers compare passages that seem at first glance impossible to reconcile. Some involve differences in chronology. Others emphasize different aspects of the same event. Still others use language that appears inconsistent until historical or literary context is considered. Scholars have proposed countless explanations for these examples. Some find those explanations persuasive. Others remain unconvinced. The existence of disagreement does not automatically settle the issue in either direction. Instead, it highlights how interpretation depends not only on the words themselves, but also on the assumptions readers bring into the text. Have you ever noticed how two people can watch the same event unfold and walk away, telling entirely different stories? One focuses on compassion. Another remembers conflict. One notices what was said. Another remembers what was implied. Neither account necessarily contains deliberate deception. Each reflects selective attention, shaped by personality, expectations, and emotional experience. Ancient narratives often work similarly. They are not always trying to function like modern investigative reports. Many were written to communicate meaning, identity, moral reflection, or theological insight alongside historical memory. Recognizing that possibility does not force anyone to abandon belief or embrace skepticism. It simply broadens the conversation. If you completely disagree with this perspective, explain why below. Some of the most valuable discussions begin when thoughtful people examine the same evidence through different lenses. The goal is not to silence disagreement, but to understand why equally sincere readers sometimes reach opposite conclusions. There is another psychological layer that receives far less attention. Many people quietly fear asking difficult questions because they worry that questioning itself signals disloyalty. Others fear accepting any answer that might preserve belief because they worry it signals intellectual weakness. In both cases, fear begins directing the conversation long before the evidence is examined. Instead of asking what is true, people begin asking which conclusion will protect their identity. Once identity enters the picture, every discussion becomes emotionally charged. Perhaps that is why debates about the Bible rarely remain confined to the text itself. They quickly become conversations about family, childhood, belonging, morality, hope, suffering, and purpose. For some, Scripture represents the foundation of life. For others, it represents difficult experiences they are trying to understand. The emotional weight surrounding those experiences influences how every apparent contradiction is perceived. The verses themselves do not carry that entire burden. People do. As the questions become deeper, one possibility slowly emerges. Perhaps the greatest contradiction is not always inside the pages. Perhaps it is the contradiction between our desire for absolute certainty and the reality that some of humanity's oldest and most influential writings continue inviting interpretation rather than eliminating it. Whether that realization strengthens faith, challenges it, or simply encourages greater humility depends less on the text alone than on the willingness of each reader to remain intellectually honest while accepting that some questions refuse to disappear simply because we wish they would. Eventually, the conversation stops being about verses. It stops being about chapter numbers, translations, manuscripts, or historical timelines. Without realizing it, you begin asking a far more personal question. Why does uncertainty make me so uncomfortable? That question reaches beyond religion because it exposes something fundamental about being human. We are meaning-making creatures. We instinctively search for patterns that make life feel predictable. When those patterns appear threatened, our first reaction is often emotional, long before it is intellectual. Think about the moments in life when certainty disappeared. A relationship you believed would last ended without warning. A career you thought defined your future suddenly vanished. Someone you trusted revealed a side of themselves you never imagined. In every one of those moments, the pain came not only from the event itself, but from the collapse of the story you had been telling yourself. The mind does not simply lose information, it loses stability. That same psychological process can emerge whenever deeply held beliefs encounter difficult questions. For some readers, discovering passages that appear to be in tension becomes a crisis because they were taught that every question must have an immediate, airtight answer. When that expectation meets reality, they feel betrayed. Others were taught that questioning itself is healthy, so they experience the same discoveries very differently. Instead of panic, they feel curiosity. The text has not changed, the reader has. That realization is easy to overlook because public debates often encourage false choices. One side insists that every apparent contradiction completely destroys the credibility of the Bible. Another insists that every apparent contradiction has already been perfectly resolved. Real life is usually more complicated. Many historians acknowledge unresolved questions while still recognizing the Bible's immense historical and cultural significance. Many believers openly admit that some passages remain difficult while continuing to see the text as spiritually authoritative. Many skeptics appreciate its literary and ethical influence even while rejecting its supernatural claims. Reality refuses to fit neatly into slogans. This is why conversations about Scripture continue generation after generation. If the questions had been universally settled long ago, people would have stopped discussing them centuries ago. Instead, scholars continue examining ancient manuscripts. Archaeologists continue uncovering new evidence. Linguists continue refining translations. Theologians continue proposing interpretations. Philosophers continue asking what these texts reveal about morality, suffering, justice, hope, and the human search for meaning. The conversation persists not because everyone is ignoring the evidence, but because the evidence often requires interpretation. There is also a danger in believing that certainty automatically equals wisdom. History is filled with people who were absolutely convinced of ideas that later proved mistaken. Humility does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing that conviction and certainty are not always the same thing. A person may hold deep beliefs while remaining open to learning. Likewise, a critic may raise serious questions while recognizing that sincere people can reasonably interpret the same material differently. Perhaps the most revealing moment comes when you notice your own emotional reaction. Which possibility frightens you more? Discovering that a text you value contains complexities you did not expect, or discovering that your assumptions about the text were incomplete? That question applies regardless, of whether you identify as religious, spiritual, agnostic, or atheist. Every worldview contains assumptions that deserve occasional examination. Growth often begins where certainty becomes uncomfortable. If this discussion has challenged you in some way, share what part stayed with you the most. Was it the psychological side of certainty, the role of interpretation, or the realization that difficult questions do not always have simple answers? Honest disagreement is often more valuable than forced agreement because it pushes everyone to think more carefully. There is an irony hidden beneath all of this. People often assume that the opposite of faith is doubt. Yet many philosophers, theologians, and psychologists have suggested something different. They argue that doubt can sometimes deepen understanding because it forces people to examine beliefs they might otherwise accept without reflection. Likewise, unquestioning skepticism can become just as rigid as unquestioning belief if it refuses to examine its own assumptions. In both cases, certainty becomes a shield against curiosity. Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden beneath the debate over apparent contradictions. The question is not simply whether tensions exist within an ancient collection of writings. The deeper question is what we do when we encounter tension anywhere in our lives. Do we immediately search for the quickest answer that restores comfort, or do we remain willing to sit with uncertainty long enough to understand the problem more deeply? That choice shapes far more than religious discussions. It shapes marriages, friendships, politics, science, education, and every meaningful conversation we will ever have. The Bible has survived centuries of scrutiny, criticism, interpretation, translation, devotion, and debate. People have approached it seeking proof, wisdom, comfort, history, philosophy, literature, and transcendence. Some have walked away believing more deeply. Others have walked away unconvinced. Many have walked away with more questions than answers. That diversity of outcomes reminds us that no text speaks in isolation. Every reader brings experiences, expectations, fears, hopes, and assumptions that influence what they see. So perhaps the most honest conclusion is not that every apparent contradiction proves everything or disproves everything. It is that ancient texts, like human beings themselves, are often more complex than we wish they were. They invite investigation rather than complacency, reflection rather than reflex, and humility rather than easy certainty. Whether those tensions ultimately strengthen your confidence, challenge it, or simply leave you thinking more carefully is a conclusion that no narrator, scholar, critic, or believer can make for you. That responsibility belongs to every reader who is willing to keep asking difficult questions without assuming that the first comfortable answer must also be the final one.